Hi, I'm Derrick Jensen. This is Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network. My guest today is Tom Butler. He's the board president of Northeast Wilderness Trust, a regional land trust that conserves forever wild landscapes, and the editorial projects director of the Foundation for Deep Ecology. A longtime conservation activist and writer, his books include Wildlands Philanthropy, Plundering Appalachia, Energy, Overdevelopment, and the Delusion of Endless Growth, and most recently the co-edited volume Keeping the Wild Against the Domestication of the Earth. So thank you for being with me, and also thank you so much for your work.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Derrick.
So today, thank you, and today let's talk about, and I would love to have you back another time to talk about other things, but right now I want to talk about this movement, do we call it, this whatever we call it, called new environmentalism. It's really emerged in the last, how long? So just
handful of years, 3 or 4 years.
Tell us about new environmentalism. What is it?
Well, this is a body of thinking. I wouldn't necessarily call it a movement, but a body of thinking that has emerged in the last several years, with really under the aegis of a number of leading spokespersons. One of them is the science journalist Emma Maris, who wrote a book called Rambunctious Garden, Misters Nordhaus and Schellenberger, who co-founded the Breakthrough Institute. There's an academic named Earl Ellis who's been put in this camp. And then probably most notably within the conservation movement, Peter Kariva, the eminent scientist who is currently the chief scientist of the Nature Conservancy. All these folks would be prominent spokespeople in this camp. And there's, you termed it new environmentalism. There's actually not a single term that these people use to self-identify. They've been called alternatively new environmentalists, new conservationists, neo-greens, postmodern greens. So there's a range of monikers that have been used to identify these folks and the kind of the general body of thinking. But if I can encapsulate what that is, for the most part, they've described a scenario in which they believe, or they assert, that we're now in a new geological epoch, and it's called the Anthropocene, the age of humanity, the age of man. And that we are, that is, our species, are essentially now the de facto planetary managers. It's here, the Earth is here, for better or ill, we're now in the driver's seat. One of the things they often like to hold up then also and to critique is to create a straw man of the wilderness movement and the wilderness idea and talk and bash the idea of pristine wilderness and say, well, if that ever did exist, that is pristine wilderness, that's all gone now, and trying to work on protecting wilderness and thinking about the wilderness idea, all that is vaguely romantic and ineffective, and that sort of thinking poorly serves today's conservation movement. Another big meme articulated by these folks, most especially Peter Kariva, is that nature is highly resilient, and that this notion of fragility that environmentalism sprang up around, that nature was somehow fragile and humans could kill it or damage it gravely, is not quite right, and that really the key characteristic of nature is resilience. That's the one we should be focused on, not fragility. And then kind of the last few things that really characterize this body of thought is really a more in terms of conservation movement tactics. And here's where it gets really interesting and in some ways really dangerous, how these ideas that are articulated within large NGOs and within graduate schools and the philanthropic community, where they percolate down to specific conservation movement tactics. Because one of the key things these folks have been arguing about is that focusing on protected areas, parks, wilderness areas, other kinds of protected conservation lands, that's kind of old school. And that the future is really about managed landscapes that people manipulate for human ends, and that should really be the focus of most conservation action. And that instead of focusing on preventing extinction, which is what most of us thought conservation was about, preventing human-caused extinction, really they assert that the focus should be on maintaining so-called ecosystem services, those things that nature provides that support human economies. And that should be conservation's primary goal. And then it's sort of in the last kind of realm of those strategic points, they talk about how conservationists shouldn't really critique capitalism. That's probably not a good tactic, but should rather partner with corporations to achieve better results. And in fact, Peter Kariva, in a rather famous quote from one of his essays, he says, quote, "Instead of scolding capitalism, conservationists should partner with corporations in a science-based effort to integrate the value of nature's benefits into their operations and cultures," end quote. So that's sort of the new environmentalism in a nutshell.
Isn't there also a fabulous quote by him about how we need to protect nature only for man? What was his quote about that? There's a pretty famous one.
Sure, yeah. I think you're thinking of a quote that he published in a paper with co-authors a few years ago that was published by the Breakthrough Institute, where he said, let's see, I think it was I'm sorry. Yeah, is this what you meant? That the second major shift we urge is that conservationists should focus foremost on regions where the degradation of ecosystem services most severely threatens the well-being of people. Is that the one you were thinking of?
Yeah.
Or were you thinking, I bet you were thinking of this one. Okay, here's a quote from Peter Kariva, chief scientist of the Nature Conservancy. "Instead of pursuing the protection of biodiversity for biodiversity's sake, that is, because of its intrinsic value, a new conservation should seek to enhance those natural systems that benefit the widest number of people, especially the poor." So there you really encapsulate it in a nutshell that the focus should not be on intrinsic value of nature or protecting the diversity of life for its own sake, but really this new conservation should be focused on areas that we actively manage or enhance so that you can keep providing ecological services or ecosystem services to the most number of people. When I read that quote, I don't know if you had the same thought, Derrick, but I suspect you might have. To me, it just sounded almost exactly like Gifford Pinchot. It's the same utilitarian ethic applied to conservation.
Yeah, that it's funny that you mentioned the thought I had, because one of the things I think is Gifford Pinchot, and one of the things that I feel, as you have been saying, all of these things is a great wave of nausea, and I find these arguments really, I don't want to just say problematical, but really harmful. And I think that these people are doing great harm to the environmental movement. And it's, I have a little bit of difficulty even doing an interview about this, because it is all so wrong-headed. It's like, where do we even begin to dissect it?
Well, I could not agree with you more. I think it is so wrong-headed. But these are serious people getting serious press time out there in the mainstream, both in academia and, unfortunately, in the mainstream press. I don't know if you ever look at that old rag called the New York Times, but in particular, Schellenberger and Nordhaus have had great success in articulating their views on the editorial pages of the New York Times. So these are ideas that are percolating beyond just the insular academic world of people who are getting graduate degrees in some environmental studies program somewhere. They're percolating out into the mainstream, and you even see the kind of traditional resource industries latching onto this, and are kind of whereas these kind of postmodern, deconstructionist-oriented green academics are making very similar type arguments than kind of traditional logging and resource and mining industries, and that's been noticed, and those people have latched onto it. So the point that you've made that these ideas are both distressing and damaging and perhaps even nauseating was what prompted a group of us, including the foundation that I work for and another small family foundation, began in 2000. Actually, Emma Maris's book was published in 2011. This very influential Breakthrough Institute journal piece by Kariva and others and co-authors was published in 2011. And those ideas were getting such kind of currency percolating out into the broader conservation community that we hosted a meeting to discuss them, to think about them, to see, to really dissect them and see, how they were being articulated and what the potential, problems were there. And then we responded in a way, probably not a very effective way, but in the way that we did with this volume called Keeping the Wild, a co-edited volume with many, many luminary conservation writers and thinkers and scientists dissecting different parts of the so-called new environmentalism and articulating what is both, patently absurd and ridiculous and insane about these ideas, and then also what is both very subtly damaging. And in probably the most brilliant chapter, there are many, many good essays, but
it's a great book, by the way. I've read it. It's a fabulous book.
Well, thank you. My co-editor of the volume, Eileen Christ, wrote just a superb chapter about the way the language of commodification and resourcism so undergirds this whole idea, our whole worldview, that we don't even see it, that our entire world is based on this notion of human supremacy. And she replies to this so-called new environmentalism, to the philosophy of it, I think, in just a really, really excellent and profound way. Whereas others kind of dissect more of the tactics. For instance, this notion that protected areas, that kind of the traditional tool of conservation, parks, wilderness areas, other kinds of strictly protected natural areas, that's somehow a tactic or a strategy to be abandoned or at least to be minimized going into the future. That, to me, is an extremely dangerous idea. Even if we concede that we are moving into the so-called Anthropocene, where the kind of the footprint or the bootprint of industrial humanity on the biosphere is readily apparent and is going to be laid down in the geological record, even if we concede that, now is not the time to be turning away from the traditional tools of conservation, but to be turning back toward them and amplifying them. And not to say that, just land conservation is going to be sufficient, but it is absolutely crucial if we're going to stop and slow down the sixth great extinction.
I have a few things I want to say. One of them is that I was asked maybe a couple years ago to write a response to the prompt, basically, what do you think of the term Anthropocene?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I wrote that I found the term really problematical for a few reasons. One of them is that this culture is part of the problem that part of the reason the world is being killed is because this culture is incredibly narcissistic. And I just read an essay or an op-ed in the New York Times about difficult decisions that will have to be made through the Anthropocene. And they were, do we save this creature or that creature? And I found the op-ed really, really problematical for a number of reasons. One of them is that that's what this culture has wanted to do from the beginning, is play God. That's the direction of the culture. But another problem I had with it is that they're talking about all these conditions. It's like, okay, we're going to save this particular shrew, this butterfly. How do we make the decisions? Never mentioned in this is, those are the ones who are on the chopping block. And never mentioned is the possibility of putting technologies on the chopping block. Never mentioned is the possibility of putting certain luxuries on the chopping block. So there's an
Well,
go ahead.
mhm.
Go ahead.
No, that's exactly right. People are so immersed in the technosphere that they don't see it. It's like the salmon in the stream, in the river, doesn't know he's in water until he gets yanked out of it by somebody's net or fishing line. You don't see that you're in the technosphere. It's very, very difficult until you kind of step out of it to a certain extent. And that's to me, one of the great and largely unarticulated values and arguments for wilderness protection. The ultimate argument for protecting parks and wilderness areas and other strictly protected natural areas is because of their support of ecological function as home for our other members of the land community, our kin. But in terms of their value to people, historically people talked about parks and wilderness areas great for human recreation, which is true. But culturally, if we're going to have any chance of turning back a culture that is fundamentally toxic to wild nature, it will mean analyzing and eventually renouncing kind of this full, wholehearted embracement of the managerial mindset that, we're going to garden everything and the entire biosphere essentially will become the technosphere. The way to start thinking outside that is to go get in a wild place where you're unplugged and see a little bit about look around and see what the world should look like. At least I found that with myself. The happiest moments that I've had in my life pretty much have been in wild settings when I was outside at least the near realm of the technosphere. And it is interesting to me, this trajectory of conservation, of kind of moving into the so-called Anthropocene and assuming that the role of humanity is as global gardeners or managers of the planetary, overseers of the planetary plantation. That we are. It is our destiny, our role to do this, and you have leading spokespersons and figures within the mainstream conservation community arguing that is the direction we must take, for better or worse. Maybe it's not what we wanted, but for better or worse, it's this globalized almost form of noblesse oblige. We're in the driver's seat now, so we have to do it. How different that is from what the American conservation movement was 80 years ago. And let me give you, for example, when Robert Marshall and others co-founded the Wilderness Society in the 1930s, do you recall what they wrote? Bob Marshall wrote, "There is just one hope of repulsing the tyrannical ambition of civilization to conquer every niche on the whole earth. That hope is the organization of spirited people who will fight for the freedom of the wilderness." 80 years ago, Bob Marshall already was seeing the trajectory of modernity and what that would do to the areas of wilderness, of self-willed land across the American West and the East as well. He was from the Adirondacks. He saw the trajectory of civilization as a tyrannical ambition to conquer everything. 80 years later, the chief scientist of the Nature Conservancy is saying, conservation needs to be about partnering with corporations and managing ecosystems to benefit the most number of people and keep the economy humming along, and is saying that nature is so resilient that it can recover rapidly from even the most powerful human disturbances, and that's a direct quote from Peter Kariba as well, and suggesting that this is the role, should be the role of conservation in the future. It's a dramatically different frame for thinking about humans' obligations and responsibilities toward the natural world.
Well,
one's gardenification, one is setting boundaries against that tyrannical ambition of a conquering force. One is war, is defending against an invading army, and the other is saying, we will manage everything for our ends. And if well, some species go extinct. We know that nature's so resilient, it can recover rapidly. That's too bad. As long as we can maintain enough ecosystem services to support the aspirations of humans, including many, many millions of poor people, then we're doing the job of conservation.
Okay, a couple things. One of them is that it is no wonder, it has not been a surprise to me that all of these people have gotten as much press as they have, because their message is completely in line with the capitalist mindset, with an imperialist mindset, with
Precisely.
I mean, so it's no wonder that the New York Times would feature them. That's no surprise to me. And there's, one of the best lines I ever wrote was one of the first lines I ever wrote. It's from a language older than words. In order to maintain our way of living, we must tell lies to each other and especially to ourselves. It's not necessary that the lies be particularly believable, but merely that they be erected as barriers to truth. And so we get this is something I really noticed. I became pretty politicized in the 80s and then became an activist in the late 80s. And by the mid-90s, I had noticed a pattern that about every 3 or 4 years there would be a new darling of the media who was anti-environmental but claiming to be really environmental.
Exactly.
Greg Easterbrook was, 1998?
Yep. And then Bjorn Lomborg.
Yep, 2002. I don't know who was 2005, but it was probably somebody. So then 2008, 2009, these people come along. Give us another couple of years, there'll be new ones. To always articulate and then get debunked, but by the time they're debunked, they've done their damage. So that's one thing I want to say. The other thing is sort of put that part of context. And the other thing I want to say is there are stolid scientists who are saying that the oceans could be devoid of fish by 2045, 2050. The oceans could be dead. And also, even if you don't go into the future, if you weighed all the fish in the oceans in 1870 and called that 100%, and then you weighed them now, that would be 10%. And this is after in 1870, after a lot of overfishing already. And so what I want to really bring up is, in terms of management, which is just a fancy word for theft, but if we talk about managing landscapes, are there any, and I'm always uncomfortable with the word any, so I don't want to hold you to this. It's like, because then you give one example, or you say, no, there's none, and then they give one example, and we're all shot down. But can you think of any landscapes that have been managed by a human supremacist mindset that have not been significantly harmed by that management? And the reason I put human supremacist mindset, and this is something we may or may not talk about in a minute, is I'm fully aware that the local Indians here would make management decisions using fire, using all sorts of other means, but they did so planning on living there for 500 years. And their land, and the Tolowa lived where I live now for at least 12,500 years, which means in any realistic sense they're living here sustainably. So I'm not talking about, quote, management, because I don't think what they did was manage. What they did is had a long-term relationship with the land. But back to the original question, would you buy a used car from these people? In terms of, they say, oh, we can manage the earth. Can they actually manage anything without destroying it?
No, I don't think there is any example that you could articulate. Of course, it depends upon what you the definition of success is. Now, if your definition of success is a landscape that maintains enough ecological function to filter water and produce clean air, and maybe support some pollinators, so some pollination services and some soil building. Well, that level of ecological function that supports that range of ecosystem services, which I hate that phrase because it even has a frame. Well, to serve who?
I want to talk about that in a second. Let's put an asterisk and come
humanity.
back to it.
But I'll answer the question. Yeah. You could get that range potentially. I mean, all kinds of different landscapes produce some level of ecosystem services, and it may be a non-native tree plantation, which is doing some of that. But that's very different than a landscape which supports all of its native species, supports the kinds of variation over time scales for that landscape, which in large part depends upon a whole range of natural processes. So these areas, this landscape has to be large enough to be influenced by natural processes. So you get that variation over time in natural succession, and that is a tremendously different standard. If you're wanting a landscape to be so healthy that all of its native species are present, all of its and in kind of normal ranges of abundance and diversity, so that they're fulfilling their ecological roles. I'm not talking about a handful of token wolves somewhere, but wolves in populations that are ecologically effective, serving their kind of top-down role in the ecosystem. So that's a totally different standard. And if you're to circle back to your question, no, I don't believe there is any example that we could offer of a major biome anywhere on Earth that has been actively managed within kind of the time frame of industrial humanity, where all of those things are still present, unless we're talking specifically about areas that were conserved and were not exploited for human resources.
I want to mention two beings whom I only recently heard about. Have you ever heard of black-skinned, pink-tusked elephants?
No, I have not.
That's because they were native to China and were exterminated by agriculture. How about Mesopotamian elephants?
No.
Same deal, Near East. My point being that those were early casualties of the managerial ethos in terms of agriculture. And I'd never heard of pink-tusked elephants before until maybe 6 months ago. And part of the problem here is that if you are the beneficiary of so I wrote a book on anarchism and some of the problems in anarchism, and it's going to come out in a year and a half or 2 years or something. Anyway, and one of the things I was talking about there's a lot of support within anarchism for pornography, and there's a lot of males have written defenses of pornography. And there, as I was writing this, it's like, wait a second. As the member of the oppressor class, you don't actually get to write something about members of a subjugated class and say that it doesn't hurt them. And it's the same with the managerial ethos here, that if you're they're talking about managing. What they mean by managing is removing resources for our use. And as a member of an oppressor class, as a white person living in the 1830s, I don't get to write an essay saying slavery isn't harmful. Do you see what I'm getting at?
I do see what you're getting at. Yeah, your point is completely valid, and I agree with you. In this problem of who writes, who creates the frames, who kind of promotes language that helps the notion, this idea of human hegemony and this human empire, stay an uncritiqued worldview. And of course, unfortunately, too often, it is not just the resource exploiters. This language is now so widely embraced, and even in unthinking ways. I'll give you the example of the phrase which we often hear among conservation circles of working landscapes, so-called working landscapes. Well, that phrase, working, was originally articulated and pioneered by some PR firm hired by the industrial forest industry in Maine. It was the first time I think that was ever used. People were getting hammered in Maine for these gigantic clear cuts, and so pretty soon you started seeing ads saying, well, that's not an ugly clear cut, it's a working forest. So, and now you see kind of mainstream environmentalists widely embraced, including Peter Kariva, when he talks, quote, about the conservation of the future will be less and less about protected areas and increasingly about working landscapes, end of quote. So you've had the mainstream environmental movement totally buy into this frame that landscapes that are manipulated, that are managed for human resource production, that's good. Who can be against working? Working is like apple pie and motherhood. And no longer do
but
we talk
working.
about...
They are working, but they're working for themselves.
Exactly. I wrote an essay once about wilderness is the ultimate working landscape because it's the one that works for all the members of the land community. That's what a working landscape should be, but that's not how it's been framed. Same thing with the another one that kills me is when people talk about other members of the biosphere, of the biotic community, of the land community, our kin, that is, our species kin, as what? Natural resources. We don't talk about, the other creatures as our fellow travelers, the community of life. We talk about them as natural resources. So, so helping to create this linguistic platform that makes hegemony over the natural world is normalized. The other one that is very subtle, but you see all the time. How often do you pick up something from an NGO, from a green group, talking about we have to work to protect our forests? Well, the possessive our there helps reinforce the notion that the forests or the earth or the rivers or whatever is being talked about belongs to us, which of course is completely nonsense. It's insane. But it's a very subtle kind of linguistic quirk that sort of helps to undergird this notion of possession, that the earth is merely this commodity, this big storehouse of resources for human use and enjoyment and profit. And until we get to these deeper ideas and begin to deconstruct that language and that worldview, then the strategies that we will employ within the environmental and conservation movements are always going to be half measures. They're going to be incomplete and insufficient.
It seems to me that there is the big divide in my mind is never between those who believe in militant resistance and those who don't. And sometimes I say the big divide is between those who do something and those who do nothing. And that's partly true in terms of activists. Most of us just sit on our butts most of the time, and it'd be great if there were more people who are actually working to protect salmon, protect whatever. But there's another question I want to bring up here, which is the real question and one of the big problems I see in the mainstream environmental movement, and this goes back to Gifford Pinchot too, is who or what are you trying to protect? That it's like all the so-called solutions to global warming that we see put forward in the mainstream, what they all have in common is they all take industrial civilization as a given and the natural world as having to conform to industrial civilization. And so this comes back to what is environmentalism for? For me, okay, this is so cool. I hate using the term "my people" because so I'm not going to use it. Then I just won't use it. So I guess the choice. But
it's okay. You can use it if you want to.
I feel so much more comfortable when I come out of a grassroots activist background and not an environmental theory. I never even heard about any of this environmental theory stuff until I'd already been an activist for years, and all the grassroots activists I knew, if you ask them why they're doing this, they will tell you for the rivers, for the critters, for the trees, because I love bull trout, because I love Selkirk caribou, because I love the sturgeon. They will tell you about some place that they're trying to save. But
exactly.
So much environmentalism, and Paul Kingsnorth talks about this, so much environmentalism has become not about saving this or that place, but about sustaining this culture that is killing the planet.
Exactly.
And that's not helpful.
You're completely right. No, it's not helpful. And it goes back to this, the age-old predicament within any social change movement of reform or incrementalists versus radicals, structural change agents. And that sort of long-standing tension, that's just integral to any whatever social change movement we'd be talking about. There's always going to be tension between reformers and radicals. But in the way that kind of is playing out currently, I think one can reasonably make a case that reform or incremental environmentalism in its perpetuation of all these frames, these cognitive and linguistic frames we've been talking about, that sort of reinforces the notion that the Earth is here for us, and gosh, we've got to get good at managing it, or we're really toast here because it's getting bad out there. They that sort of trajectory or trend, in some ways, I think, is more profoundly problematic now because things are so dire. When there is such a grave need for questioning and doing a deep systemic analysis of what are truly the drivers of the sixth extinction crisis, what are truly the drivers of climate change, which is, of course, climate change is simply an unintended side effect of a bad culture, of too many people behaving badly. Not because they're malevolent. I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to go out and try to trash the planet today. No, there's an Earth that is overpopulated, a huge number of people.
We can have that discussion, by the way, about malevolence. That's another discussion.
Oh, okay, and yeah, you're true. There may be a few. Okay, I'll concede your point, but I think by and large, it is a thoughtless and unfortunate side effect of too many people and the technologies we have used, and all of that stems from our ideas, from our worldview, from our bad culture. And this is why you almost never hear in mainstream environmentalism, you'll hear all kinds of things about green energy or growing our way out of this or that, but you almost never hear any kind of straightforward coming directly at the notion of anthropocentrism, at human-centeredness. Because that is something that everyone across the political spectrum can agree on. Whether you're from the Cliven Bundy type to the kind of the far left end of the spectrum, the vast majority of human beings, if you're an Occupy person talking about, well, the pie isn't divided up right, or you're the Cliven Bundy, public lands rancher from that ilk, pretty much the only thing you're going to agree on across that political spectrum, the vast majority of people, is that the Earth is for us. It's here for us. And until ecologists or specifically conservationists and environmentalists are willing to go at this question of worldview, then I'm repeating myself, I know, but the kinds of strategies and tactics that we advance are going to be half measures or less. They will be utterly insufficient to address the nature of the problem, because you simply cannot grow your way into some sort of green nirvana with 8 billion consumers driving Priuses with solar panels on the roof. It doesn't work. And let's say even if it were possible that there could be some vast transformation in human consciousness where the elites of the world, the truly rich and powerful, decided, well, you're right, we got too much. Let's redistribute the wealth. And the fossil fuel industry said, yeah, you're right, we're putting too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We'll ramp down, we'll transfer all our assets to solar and wind power, and we'll grow the green economy. Let's say all that magical thinking could happen, but your underlying worldview was still that we're going to garden the planet to support human health and welfare and human economic aspirations. And we're still going to try to grow this techno-industrial economy toward wherever. I mean, it just is supposed to grow forever on a finite planet. You would not be solving the extinction crisis. And the ultimate measure of whether your culture is right, at least it seems to many of us, is, are you causing other members of the land community to go extinct? Our kin, the products of the same sorts of wild and evolutionary processes that created us, our kin in the community of life, are our actions causing them to go extinct? If so, our culture is not sustainable, and our culture is evil. And this is kind of something the mainstream environmental community does not go into in any depth. If you're trying to promote this candidate that'll, vote your way a little more, or you're trying to promote green energy, and you're not going to get to these deeper questions of how the economy is structured, who benefits, what the power relationships are, and what are these linguistic and cognitive frames that undergird this whole human project, this whole notion of human supremacy that everybody agrees on, right to left.
I love what you're saying. This is all so great, and I would love to have you back on again because I want to talk about this for hours and hours. I want to do a quote here from someone where somebody said, if you take a look at biological success, which is essentially measured by how many of us there are, that's the quote. And I ripped that quote apart for a couple pages in a book I'm doing right now because I think it's just crazy. And what I say, I propose a different measure for biological success than just numbers, because of course that one is just like computer games or go forth and multiply projected on the natural world. The biological success isn't how many of you there are. Here's what here's a definition I like, and I want to know what you think.
What is it?
A better measure of biological success would be whether the presence and population of a given species improves the health and resilience of the larger biotic community of whom it is a member and on whom it relies for sustenance, thereby ensuring its own species survival as well as the survival of other members of its biotic community.
Exactly.
And that's a huge, even the point in bringing all that up is that that's a difference. You're talking about how this human supremacism affects, and colonialist mindset affects every part of our discourse.
Every part of our discourse, even within the environmental movement, which is what is so frustrating. The one place you would think, if there's any social change movement, we can't expect it necessarily from social justice movement or the peace movement or the women's movement. It's got to be coming from the ecological movement, and who, while partnered with all of those other important, social change communities, has to be always articulating the primacy of wild nature, the primacy of biotic integrity, because there is no, peace and justice. There's no women's rights on a dead planet. So we're saying, ecological health has to come first, and if the ecological movement is not dissecting these linguistic and cognitive frames that undergird human supremacy, then who will do it? No one will challenge these sources, which are unarticulated, largely unnoticed sources of power that serve the needs, and in kind of the first world, the overdeveloped world, the techno-industrial growth world, primarily serve the needs of large capital. And that's another thing. You can write astutely and cogently and consistently about this, but until very recently, how often did you see anyone kind of even raising the C word? Nobody wants to talk about capitalism in terms of within the mainstream environmental community, because it both kind of is considered too risky or damaging to potential funders and all of that. And now it's been nice to see, at least in the last few years, Naomi Klein's brand new book, Richard Heinberg's The End of Growth, Jerry Mander's book, The Capitalism Papers. At least some folks with sort of relatively mainstream credibility are talking about the problem of mega technologies, including our economic technology, which is techno-industrial growth capitalism. And the structural problems of that are not simply a maldistribution of wealth, but killing the biosphere. So there's at least a little bit of progress, at least it seems to me. I'm curious to know what you think about that.
I think there's been some progress until you tell me about quotes by Bob Marshall, in which case I think, well, we haven't gone anywhere. And it's the same with Lewis Mumford. You read Lewis Mumford, he's laying it out too. And
yeah, exactly. 80 years ago, 70 years ago.
And of course, if you read what any of the indigenous people were saying 500 years ago, it's all, once again, this analysis of the dominant culture being destructive of the planet is, it's going to go back to the beginnings of the dominant culture. There's been a few people who get it. I wish there was more of it. So we've only got like 2 minutes left, and I wanted to address the asterisk of environmental services, but maybe we should save that for another time. What would you like? Okay, so somebody later tonight says, "Oh, I heard this great radio interview today. It was fabulous." And the other person says, "What was it about?" And what do you want them to say? What is the, like, Star Wars 20 years later, I remember use the Force. What do you want people to take away from this, that their one take-home message that they really understand in their hearts?
That the notion of human supremacy is fanciful. It's an aberration, or it's not just an aberration. It is first of all, it's maladaptive, but it's also simply, wrong. It's wrong-headed, and it is not accurate. And any kind of repeating myself again, but any kind of language or cognitive framing that suggests that the Earth is here for humanity, and that we have the either obligation or the responsibility to manage it, is a wrong-headed and dangerous notion. And one of the best ways of sort of renouncing that is to be actively plugged into the conservation movement, particularly part of that wing of the movement that is working for specific places and creatures. And this is, to me, one of the great things about the American wilderness movement, that within the context of this industrial growth society, this industrialization that swept across the continent, you had this counter-revolutionary force, this group of people who said, no, some places we won't log, we won't ranch, we won't mine. Some places we will set aside because nature, wild places and wild creatures have a right to exist for their own sake. To me, that was, a remarkable and profoundly hopeful idea, because it expanded the sphere of our ethical concern to all the members of the land community. And that is a hopeful thing, and plugging into that still vital American wilderness movement is a great way of starting to push back against this so-called Anthropocene idea.
So that would be a great place to end, but I can't end there.
Okay.
Because I want to raise one more issue as a teaser for I hope you'll be back again.
I'd be delighted to.
And this is a teaser for next time. It seems to me that one of the things that is central, and I want you to quickly respond to this, one of the things that's central to this is there's a notion that only humans have purpose and only humans have the wherewithal to be able to manage a forest. And the question becomes, who is better at taking care of a forest, humans or the forest itself? Well,
we can tell if we look at the health, particularly the landscape where I live, let's just say, the northeastern U.S. temperate forest. For the time period before Europeans settled this landscape, forests existed for a long period of time. We know what was here when Euro-Americans got to this landscape, and we know the kind of what's here now. The evidence suggests that the forests were far healthier than before we actively managed or manipulated them. So my short answer, of course, is that nature knows best, nature bats last, and nature knows how to run a forest far better than humans ever will because of our incomplete knowledge. The other point on that is that the idea that humans ever could have the capacity, having come out of this system that produces wildness, and that we would want to so control the kind of the levers, or to use a mechanistic metaphor, the levers and the pulleys of natural systems, so that we get to decide how kind of the trajectory of evolutionary processes go, evolutionary flourishing. To me, that both is crazy for both ethical reasons and for utilitarian ones, because our knowledge is always going to be incomplete. There is no evidence to suggest that our activities are going to be able to sustain the planet's life support systems in a way that is going to support all of the members of the community of life, including us. So for both kind of biocentric and utilitarian reasons, we have every reason to try to manipulate as little as possible and with a great deal of humility, and try to manage what we must in kind of nature's shadow as best we can, mirroring nature's richness and integrity, and not assuming the human cleverness is adequate to do the job.
Well, thank you so much for everything you've said. And I would like to thank listeners for listening. My guest today has been Tom Butler. This is Derrick Jensen for Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network.